It started with the sound of crunching apples at sunrise, the wet pop of fruit under tires, and the lazy hum of a woman who believed the world bent for her convenience, a sound so steady and smug it cut through the mist that rolled low across our orchard every morning. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, drove her little golf cart straight through our rows like it was a parade route, one hand holding her coffee, the other filming herself for her neighborhood Facebook group, smiling as she crushed fallen apples and splattered juice over the roots of trees my grandpa had planted 40 years ago. Grandpa watched from the porch every time, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes, saying nothing except for that one line that always came out calm and certain, like he'd already measured her downfall in his head. Every fence needs a reason before it's built. The orchard stretched like gold across the valley floor, trees lined up like disciplined soldiers, heavy with fruit that gleamed against the morning light. We worked it by hand, sunup to sundown, no machines except Grandpa's old Massey tractor that coughed like a smoker. But she never cared. She'd cut through the same path each day, right past the no trespassing sign that leaned a little to the left, waving like she owned the place. Sometimes she'd shout a fake friendly "morning, neighbors," as though that made it fine. Grandpa didn't wave back. He just chewed the inside of his cheek, the way he did when his patience was fermenting into something sharper. I asked him one morning why we didn't just block her. He spat a seed into the dirt and said, "You can't build a wall till you know who's on which side of it." A week later she brought her dog, a yapping ball of fluff that tore through the lower rows, scattering rabbits and clawing at the bark. She called it socializing. Grandpa called it trespassing. When he told her that, she rolled her eyes and said, "This is a community property, old man, you can't just claim land people have always used." She drove off before he could reply, kicking up dust that clung to the air like bad manners. The next morning we found a broken branch, a cracked irrigation pipe, and a new set of tire marks. It wasn't just annoyance anymore, it was damage. Still, Grandpa didn't call the sheriff. He walked the fence line slow and quiet, ran his fingers along the wire, and started measuring with that old carpenter's tape he'd carried since the 70s. By evening, he'd marked the boundary with stakes and red ribbons, each one flicking in the wind like a warning. I thought that would stop her. But Karen showed up the next morning wearing sunglasses big enough to block out shame. She stopped in front of Grandpa, sipped her coffee, and said, "You can't fence off what's been community access for years." He didn't even look at her. He just said, "You can't drink manners out of a cup." That made her laugh, a sharp little sound that didn't match the morning birds. She pulled out her phone and said she was recording harassment for the HOA records. Grandpa just turned away and kept measuring. Later that day, the HOA president, a slick man named Rick with a tie that didn't belong in the countryside, came by with his clipboard and fake smile. He said, "We've had reports you're interfering with neighborhood traffic flow." Grandpa looked at him and said, "Through my orchard?" Rick smiled wider, the kind of smile that says he's used to people giving up when they see paperwork. He started talking about bylaws, about right-of-way, about cooperative community standards. Grandpa didn't argue. He let him talk till the sun started to dip, then pointed to the oak tree at the edge of the orchard and said, "That's where my land starts. And that's where it ends. You can put your traffic flow in between if you can float it." Rick didn't get it, but I did. He meant the creek that cut between the two properties, an old natural line no map could erase. That night, we sat on the porch, lantern light catching the edge of Grandpa's jaw as he whittled a piece of applewood into something small and sharp. He said, "She's not gonna stop till she hits a wall. Best make sure the wall's worth hitting." I didn't know what he meant then. But 2 mornings later, Karen didn't come through on the usual path. Instead, she tried to go around the far side, where the irrigation ditch ran deep. I saw her wheel slide, the cart tilt, and her coffee arc through the air like slow-motion justice. She was fine, just muddy and furious, but she stomped straight to our porch dripping water and entitlement. "You'll pay for this," she said. Grandpa looked up, calm as ever, and said, You fell into your own shortcut. That night, she called the sheriff. The man came out, shook Grandpa's hand, and said, "You know how this goes, old friend. Just keep it civil." Karen stood there with her arms crossed, muttering about lawsuits and access rights. The sheriff tipped his hat and said, "Ma'am, you don't have rights on what ain't yours." Her face went red enough to match the apples. The next day, the HOA posted a letter on our gate claiming community easement privileges. Grandpa didn't even read it all. He folded it neatly, slipped it under his coffee mug, and said, "Guess I've got my reason now." I could feel it then, the shift in the air, the calm before something built to last longer than word. The orchard seemed quieter that evening, like even the wind was waiting. The sun went down behind the ridge, and Grandpa stood there in the fading light, eyes fixed on the open path where she used to drive. He said nothing for a long time, then finally muttered, "A gate ain't meant to keep people out. It's meant to show who belongs in." That was the night he started sketching designs on the back of seed catalogs, muttering about hinges and lock. I didn't realize it yet, but the moment he said that line, the whole story began. The fence, the gate, the reckoning, and it all started with one woman who couldn't tell the difference between a shortcut and a boundary. The next week felt like watching a storm gather in slow motion, the kind that starts with a few harmless clouds and ends with fences blown sideways and tempers split open. Word spread through the valley that Grandpa had started trouble with the HOA, which was funny because all he'd done was measure his own land. But in a small town with big mouths, stories grow faster than weeds. By Monday, the HOA had scheduled a special community meeting to address what they called the Orchard Path dispute, like it was some landmark legal case instead of one woman's need to cut 5 minutes off her morning walk. Grandpa didn't want to go, said he'd rather fix irrigation than argue with people allergic to hard work, but I convinced him. I told him if we didn't show up, they'd spin the story until we looked like villains. He grunted and said, "Fine, but I'm wearing my hat." That hat was his armor, wide-brimmed and sweat-stained, and when he wore it, people knew he wasn't there to play nice. The meeting was held in the HOA clubhouse, a shiny barn-shaped building that smelled like disinfectant and fake pine. Karen sat in front, arms folded, surrounded by her little court of gossiping neighbors. Rick, the president, stood by a projector with slides labeled Community Harmony and Shared Spaces. I almost laughed. He started the meeting with his politician's voice, talking about unity and cooperation, but everyone knew what it was about. Karen cut in halfway through his speech and said, "We all know why we're here. Some people think they can just wall off community land." Her eyes landed on Grandpa, smug and gleaming. Grandpa didn't move. He just said, "If it's yours, show me your name on the deed." The room went quiet. Rick cleared his throat and brought out a map, printed from Google Earth, with bright yellow lines drawn over it. "As you can see, this path," he said, pointing at our orchard like it was his backyard, "has been used for decades by community members. Under common law, this constitutes a de facto easement." Grandpa leaned forward. "You got that from the internet, didn't you?" A few people chuckled. Karen didn't. She hissed, "You can't just fence people out, old man." Grandpa smiled slightly, a dangerous kind of calm, and said, "I'm not fencing you out. I'm fencing the apples in." The crowd murmured again, half laughter, half awkward silence. Rick tried to restore order, but Grandpa reached into his folder and pulled out something heavier than any argument they had, our deed. Yellowed edges, notarized seal, and a boundary map drawn by the county itself. He slid it across the table like a card in a poker game. "This here says the line runs 50 feet past where she drives. And if you follow that, your so-called right-of-way runs straight into my fence line." Rick squinted, looking more nervous now. "We'll need time to verify that," he said. Karen leaned over him, snapping, "Don't let him intimidate you. The HOA can override these things if it benefits the community." Grandpa tilted his head. "You mean if it benefits you?" She slammed her notebook shut. "I walk my dog there every morning. It's peaceful. It's tradition. Grandpa stood, slow and deliberate. Then I suggest a new tradition, using your own road. For a moment no one spoke. Then someone in the back said, "He's got a point." Rick frowned. "Let's not escalate things. This is a friendly discussion." But it wasn't friendly anymore. Karen's voice rose, sharp and theatrical. "You don't understand. This affects property values. If you close that path, we lose access to the creek view." Grandpa turned toward her. "Funny, I thought property value came from respecting boundaries." That line landed harder than he meant. Even a few HOA members snorted. Karen's face turned crimson. She gathered her purse and said, "You'll regret this. I have friends on the county board." Grandpa nodded once. "Then bring them apples." We walked out while the room buzzed behind us, people whispering about deeds, easements, and who was right. Outside, the sun had started to set behind the clubhouse, staining the sky orange. Grandpa didn't say a word the whole drive home. He just stared ahead, jaw tight, hat shadowing his eyes. When we got back to the orchard, he parked the truck, stepped out, and walked straight to the boundary line where the first fence post stood. He knelt down, pressed his hand to the dirt, and said quietly, "She'll test it again." I asked if we'd won. He shook his head. "Winning's when they stop coming." This was just the opening act. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way Karen had looked at him, like someone used to getting her way and already planning revenge. The next morning, I found new tire tracks through the far edge of the orchard, deeper this time, like she'd gone out of her way to make a point. Grandpa saw them too but didn't speak. Instead, he went into the shed and pulled out a roll of orange construction ribbon. By noon, he'd marked every corner of our property again, each ribbon tied high enough to catch the light and flutter like a line in the sand. Around evening, Rick showed up again, this time alone. He looked tired, less confident. "Look," he said, "between us, she's persistent. You could just leave it open. Save yourself the headache." Grandpa wiped his hands on his jeans. "Headache's fine. I'm not giving up my ground." Rick sighed and handed him a paper. "Just a formality. A notice of potential violation for unapproved boundary structures." She filed it before the meeting. Grandpa read the first line, then folded the paper and handed it back. "Tell her to file it under fiction." Rick looked defeated. "She's gonna push this to the county. She's already got a surveyor coming Friday." Grandpa just nodded. "Good. I'll have coffee ready for him." After Rick left, I asked what he was going to do. Grandpa stared out at the orchard, where the light hit the ribbons like tiny fires in the breeze. "A fence doesn't stop someone like her," he said. "But a gate does." That was when I realized he wasn't thinking about boundaries anymore. He was thinking about consequences, the kind you could touch. That night, the crickets were loud, the kind of loud that fills the air when a storm's building over the ridge. Grandpa sat on the porch, pencil in hand, drawing plans on a scrap of wood. I asked him what kind of fence he was building. He said, "The kind that teaches manners." The next morning, Karen drove by on the road outside, not through the orchard this time, but slow enough to make sure we saw her. She waved her coffee cup, grinning. Grandpa tipped his hat without smiling. He waited until she was gone, then whispered, "Every fence needs a reason before it's built. I think we've got ours." The first post went into the ground before sunrise, the sound of the hammer echoing down the valley like a slow heartbeat, steady and unbothered, the kind of rhythm that means a man has already made up his mind. The ground was still cold from the night dew, and every swing sent small puffs of mist from the dirt, catching the light like breath. Grandpa worked in silence, his movements deliberate, each nail driven in with the same quiet authority that made people listen even when he said nothing. I helped hold the boards, feeling the tension in the air shift with every piece of wire stretched tight between the posts. It wasn't just a fence going up. It was a line drawn through pride, patience, and a lifetime of knowing when to act. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, the orchard looked different, the way a battlefield looks different once trenches are dug. From the house porch, you could see the glint of new metal hinges and the faint outline of a gate that hadn't yet been hung. Karen drove by 3 times that morning, pretending to check her mailbox, which was half a mile away. She didn't stop, just stared long enough for us to see her sunglasses flash like warning lights. Around noon, Rick showed up again, his tie gone, sleeves rolled, the clipboard looking heavier this time. "You're really doing this," he said, squinting at the new fence line. Grandpa didn't pause. "Wasn't aware it needed your permission." Rick sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're going to make her furious." Grandpa finally looked up. "Son, she was born furious." Rick laughed quietly, but it wasn't friendly. He handed over another letter, this one thicker than the last. "She filed a formal complaint with the HOA board. They'll be inspecting tomorrow." Grandpa nodded. "Good. They'll get a nice view." That night we worked under lantern light, finishing the lower panels. The orchard smelled of sap and fresh-cut wood. Every sound, the squeak of nails, the buzz of night insects, felt sharper, like the world was holding its breath. Grandpa welded the gate hinge himself, sparks bouncing off his boots, the glow reflecting in his glasses. "This one's staying," he muttered as he shut the welder off, and I believed him. When dawn came, the fence stood complete, stretching across the orchard edge like a scar, clean, straight, and impossible to ignore. The gate was made from repurposed barn steel, heavy enough to stop a truck if needed. Grandpa locked it with an old brass padlock that looked like it had waited decades for its purpose. The first car that arrived wasn't the HOA inspector, it was Karen. She rolled up in her golf cart, revving like she thought the noise would make a point. "You can't block this off," she shouted before she was even out of the seat. "This is illegal." Grandpa leaned on the fence post, unbothered. "Funny, I don't remember you asking permission when you drove through." She huffed, pulled out her phone, and started recording. "I'm documenting this for our records. You're violating HOA property codes." Grandpa's voice didn't rise. "This land's county property, not yours. And last I checked, apples don't read bylaws." She sputtered something about trespass ordinances and neighborhood consensus, but Grandpa had already turned back to tightening the wire. She stomped off, muttering, "You'll regret this." Later that afternoon, 2 SUVs showed up with magnetic, HOA compliance, stickers on the sides, which made Grandpa laugh so hard he nearly dropped his wrench. 3 people stepped out, Rick, a woman with a clipboard, and a man who looked like he hadn't smiled since the Nixon administration. The woman introduced herself as HOA Field Officer for Community Standards. Grandpa nodded politely and offered them water, which they refused. She said, "We've received complaints about unauthorized structures and potential interference with community easements." Grandpa motioned toward the gate. "Structures right there. Easements imaginary." She frowned. "We'll need to verify that." He pointed to the survey stakes, still bright orange in the grass. "Already did. County lines. You can check the registry if you want." She didn't like that answer, but the older man started pacing along the fence, muttering measurements under his breath. Rick stood back, watching, looking like he wanted to disappear. After 10 minutes, the man stopped and said, "He's right. The fence is well within the property boundary." The woman looked annoyed. "That doesn't mean it's allowed." Grandpa smiled. "Doesn't mean it's not." They left without shaking hands. That evening, Karen posted a video in the HOA Facebook group. She stood by the gate, dramatic as a soap opera star, claiming we had blocked historical community access and endangered local pets and walkers. It spread fast, with comments ranging from sympathy to sarcasm. One guy wrote, "Maybe stop walking on private land?" Another said, "Looks like someone finally told Karen no." Grandpa read the thread over dinner, chuckling between bites. "They'll eat each other alive before I have to say another word," he said. Still, I noticed he checked the locks twice that night. The next morning, the sheriff drove up, same man as before, his cruiser rolling slow down the gravel drive. He tipped his hat and said, "Morning, Sam. You've caused quite the stir." Grandpa poured him coffee without a word. The sheriff leaned against the porch rail. "Got a call about a hostile enclosure." Grandpa raised an eyebrow. "You mean a fence?" The sheriff shrugged. "That's what I said." They didn't like the answer. He looked out toward the orchard. "You staying civil?" Grandpa nodded. "As long as they stay on their side." The sheriff smiled faintly. "Good enough. For me." When he left, Karen was parked at the edge of the property, glaring, phone raised again. Grandpa ignored her. That evening, we replaced the temporary locks with a custom latch Grandpa had forged in the shed, one that clicked shut with a deep, satisfying sound. He painted the gate a dull green to match the orchard, blending strength with calm, and when he was done, he just stood there, hands on his hips, breathing in the silence. "Looks good," I said. He nodded. "It's not about looks. It's about lessons." The next day, Karen tried something new. She waited until we went into town for supplies and then snuck through the back path, cutting the fence wire in 3 places. We found it when we got home: fresh tracks, footprints, and a slice of wire hanging loose like an insult. Grandpa didn't say a word. He walked to the barn, grabbed new wire, and repaired it before the sun set. Then he reinforced it with a double twist and steel mesh. By morning, the gap was stronger than before. "She'll keep testing it," I said. "Good," he replied. "That's how you find weak spots." The next time she came through, she didn't bring her golf cart. She came walking, arms crossed, camera out, muttering about illegal barriers. She stopped when she saw Grandpa standing by the gate with a calm expression and something new in his hand, a copy of the deed in a plastic sleeve. "This is harassment," she said. "This is proof," he answered. She looked uncertain for the first time. "You think this will stop me?" she asked. Grandpa smiled, not kindly. "No, ma'am. The gate will." She walked away, still recording, but slower now, her confidence dented. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the orchard glowed in the warm light, rows of trees casting long shadows that reached toward the locked gate. Grandpa leaned on the post and said quietly, "You build a fence to stop a thing, but sometimes it's the waiting that does the real work." That night, thunder rolled somewhere far off, and for the first time in weeks, Karen didn't come back through. The fence stood silent and unbothered, a line of calm defiance under the moonlight, and Grandpa smiled like a man who'd just placed the first move in a very long game. Karen didn't vanish. She regrouped, the way a wasp does after being swatted away, circling slower, quieter, waiting for another opening. For a few days she stopped showing up altogether, which made Grandpa suspicious rather than relieved. He said silence was a liar's smile, and he was right. The first sign of her next move came in the form of a shiny pickup rolling up to the orchard one afternoon, carrying a man in a neon vest with a clipboard. He had that look of someone paid by the hour to pretend he's in charge. "Surveyor," he said when Grandpa met him at the gate. "Got authorization from the HOA to verify public easements." Grandpa's expression didn't shift. "Authorization from the HOA don't work on county land." The man frowned and waved a piece of paper. "This is official." Grandpa took one glance at the letterhead, smirked, and said, "Son, this was printed off a home computer." The surveyor shuffled awkwardly but still stepped toward the gate, until Grandpa's voice cut sharper. "Touch that fence and you'll be trespassing." The man hesitated, took a step back, muttered something about calling his client, and left. Later that day Karen posted another video online, ranting about local tyrants and blocking public access, her voice dripping with fake outrage. But now she wasn't alone. 3 of her friends from the HOA showed up in the comments, promising community action. Grandpa read it over his evening tea, squinting at the screen like he was studying pests under a magnifying glass. "She's gathering a swarm," he said. "They always do before they get stung." The next morning, sure enough, 3 SUVs pulled up along the road, and a small crowd in pastel shirts and sun hats started marching toward the orchard like it was some protest for justice. Karen led them, of course, waving a binder and shouting about equal rights to shared property. Grandpa stayed calm, wiping his hands on a rag as if preparing to prune trees rather than face an angry mob. When they reached the gate, Karen started reading some legal paragraph off a printed HOA policy. Grandpa let her finish, then said simply, "That policy stops where my dirt starts." She tried the latch, found it locked, and turned to her friends dramatically. "See? He's restricting our access." One of the men, tall and red-faced, stepped forward and shook the gate hard enough to rattle the hinges. Grandpa didn't move, just stared him down till the man dropped his hands. "This is going on record," Karen announced. "We'll see what the sheriff says about you blocking a public right-of-way." Grandpa shrugged. "Same thing he said last time, get off private property." They retreated eventually, but the damage wasn't done. That night, someone threw 2 bags of trash over the fence, one splitting open against the post, scattering empty wine bottles and take-out boxes across the grass. Grandpa cleaned it up himself before sunrise. "Don't feed Petty," he said. "It grows fat quick." Still, he wasn't idle. Over the next few days he made several quiet trips to town, visiting the county records office, the courthouse, and an old friend named Walt who used to work as a land assessor. When he came back, his expression had changed. He spread out a stack of papers on the kitchen table, maps older than both of us combined, some drawn by hand with the county seal stamped in faded ink. "This here," he said, pointing to a narrow blue line, "is the old irrigation easement from before the HOA existed. It cuts through her property, not ours." I leaned closer. "So what does that mean?" He grinned, the slow kind that carries both satisfaction and mischief. "Means she's been using the wrong argument. And when this gets to the county board, her path's gonna look a lot less like tradition and a lot more like trespassing." The next morning he filed the papers officially, quiet as a shadow. Karen, unaware, doubled down. She hired another inspector, this one pretending to be from the zoning office, who drove up with a clipboard and a fake badge. Grandpa met him halfway down the road, smiled politely, and asked for his ID. The man fumbled, muttered something about oversight, and drove away fast. By afternoon, Grandpa had security cameras up along the fence line, not to catch her but to keep evidence clean. "You never win a war by shouting," he said. "You win it by letting the other side trip on their own noise." 2 days later, she did exactly that. Karen, furious from another HOA meeting where half the members sided with Grandpa after seeing the deed, decided to stage her own demonstration. She showed up at dawn with a camera crew, really just her son holding a phone, and a sign that said, "No to rural bullies." She marched right up to the fence, started talking to the camera about freedom of access, and without thinking, pushed the latch open. The gate creaked, moved a few inches, and then stopped cold against the lock. She yanked harder, shouting about illegal barriers, until the sound of tires on gravel broke through her speech. The sheriff's truck rolled up slow, the same man as before, sipping his coffee like he'd been expecting the call. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Filming another movie?" Karen froze. "I'm documenting a crime." He smiled. "Whose?" She stammered, waved her binder. "This is HOA property." He looked at Grandpa, who stood behind the fence, arms crossed. "Same land." Grandpa nodded. The sheriff took off his hat, rubbed his forehead, and said, "Ma'am, this land's been registered private since before your subdivision was built. I told you that last time." Karen tried to argue, but the sheriff held up a hand. "You're trespassing right now, and this video's your proof. I suggest you step back." She went red but did as she was told, muttering curses under her breath. The sheriff gave Grandpa a small nod before driving off. Karen stood there for a few seconds, shaking with fury, then stormed away to her golf cart. That evening, her video hit the HOA page again, edited with dramatic music and captions calling Grandpa a local tyrant. It backfired spectacularly. The comments turned against her within hours. One neighbor wrote, "Karen, maybe just use the road like everyone else?" Another added, "That fence looks legal to me." By nightfall, even Rick posted something subtle: "Let's all respect property lines and avoid conflict." Grandpa laughed for a full minute when he saw that one. But Karen wasn't done. She printed flyers claiming HOA rights violated by rogue landowner and slipped them into mailboxes around town. Most people tossed them out, but a few curious folks came by to see what the fuss was about. When they saw the orchard, neat and peaceful behind the new gate, they just nodded in approval. "Looks good," one said. About time someone stood up to her. Karen must have seen that too, because the next day she tried her most desperate move yet. She called a lawyer. A week later, Grandpa received a letter on fancy paper claiming we were being sued for obstruction of common access. He read it over breakfast, chuckled, and said, "She's digging her own ditch now." I asked if we needed a lawyer. "Not yet," he said. "Let her spend her money first." Still, I could see the fatigue in his shoulders. It wasn't fear, just weariness from dealing with people who mistake noise for power. That night, as the crickets hummed and the moon cast pale light across the rows, Grandpa sat by the fence, staring at the gate. "You think she'll quit?" I asked. He shook his head. "She'll come one more time. People like her always do. They can't stand not having the last word." His eyes gleamed faintly in the dark. "And when she does, we'll be ready." The wind moved through the orchard like breath, stirring the branches and making the lock on the gate click softly in the night, a quiet promise that the storm wasn't over, it was just waiting for dawn. The dawn she chose for her grand revenge was the kind that looked peaceful only if you weren't paying attention, with fog curling low through the trees, and the kind of heavy silence that makes birds hesitate before singing. I woke to the sound of gravel crunching outside, and the faint hum of Karen's golf cart engine, that familiar sputter she always claimed was eco-friendly transportation. I stepped onto the porch and saw her, hair tied up tight, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, a triumphant smirk spread across her face. This time she wasn't alone. 2 men followed behind her with clipboards and matching neon vests, and one held a small camera mounted on a stick. She called out before I could say a word. "We're recording this for documentation," she shouted. "You are interfering with a legal right of way." Grandpa came out beside me, hat already on, calm as ever. "You sure you want to document this, ma'am?" he asked, his voice steady but sharp. She sneered. "You'll see what documentation does in court." She motioned to one of the men to start walking. The first guy opened the gate latch, tugged, and found it locked. Karen grinned like she'd expected that, waving at her cameraman. "See? This is what I've been saying: illegal barriers, dangerous obstructions, pure harassment." Grandpa just watched. He didn't move an inch, didn't interrupt, just let her dig her hole deeper. She turned back to us. "You can't block this road. The HOA board has approved my claim." Grandpa leaned forward slightly. "You mean the same board that told you last week to leave it alone?" She froze for half a second, her eyes flickering, but then she recovered with a dramatic laugh. "You think this is over? You can't just hide behind your little fence forever." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded paper, waving it like a flag. "Court notice," she said proudly. "You'll be hearing from my attorney." Grandpa smiled slightly, but it wasn't amusement. It was something colder, quieter, the kind of look he wore before delivering a hard truth. "That's funny," he said. "Because I filed first." Her confidence cracked like thin ice. "You what?" He nodded toward the porch, where a thick envelope sat by the coffee mug. "Counterclaim. Trespassing, property damage, and harassment. County clerk stamped it yesterday." For a moment, she looked like someone had pulled the ground out from under her. Then her pride caught up to her mouth. "You're bluffing," she said, voice trembling but still sharp. Grandpa didn't answer. He just turned and walked back toward the orchard, saying over his shoulder, "Keep recording." You'll want proof of this next part. She blinked, confused, until the sound reached her. Low, distant, mechanical. The irrigation pumps kicked on, the ones Grandpa had spent all week fixing and rerouting. Water rushed through the ditches, strong and fast, filling the new channels that cut along the orchard's edge. One of the men stepped too close, the muddy ground giving way beneath him. He slipped, splashed down, cursing as his clipboard floated away. The cameraman tried to help him up but nearly fell himself. Karen's voice rose an octave. "Turn it off. You're flooding the access road." Grandpa's voice came back calm, loud enough to carry. "That's not a road, ma'am. That's a working irrigation line, filed and approved with the county. Just got reinstated last week." She looked down at the water swirling around her shoes, realization dawning too slow. "You can't do this," she screamed. "You're destroying public land." Grandpa stopped walking, turned and said, "It's my land. You just parked in it." She looked around like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The water kept rising, not dangerously, just enough to make the ground too soft for her golf cart to move. The wheels spun helplessly, spraying mud in every direction. The cameraman had stopped filming and was trying to push the cart out, but the back tires sank deeper with every shove. Karen's voice broke into frantic yelling, her perfect composure washing away like the dirt around her feet. Grandpa stood there with his hands in his pockets, watching her struggle, not cruelly but with the kind of tired patience that comes from knowing lessons sometimes have to hurt to stick. The sheriff's cruiser appeared again, slow and steady down the road, same familiar man behind the wheel. He stepped out, surveying the scene, then gave Grandpa a look that said he wasn't even surprised. "Morning," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "Let me guess, she drove into a working ditch." Karen spun around, pointing at him. "He did this on purpose. He's sabotaging community access." The sheriff looked at her shoes sinking in the mud, then at the camera half submerged in the water. "Ma'am," he said, "you're trespassing again. This time it's recorded, and not by him." One of the men tried to protest, saying something about easement rights, but the sheriff cut him off. "County registry shows this line as active agricultural irrigation. It's legal and private. You folks need to leave before I start writing citations." Karen's face went pale. "You can't." The sheriff's tone shifted, no longer patient. "Ma'am, I can." He turned to Grandpa. "You want me to charge them?" Grandpa shook his head. "Let them go. They've learned enough for today." The sheriff nodded and helped the men pull the golf cart free while Karen stood trembling, half from anger, half from humiliation. When the cart finally lurched free, its wheels caked in mud, she didn't say a word. She just glared at Grandpa with the kind of hatred people reserve for mirrors that tell the truth. She sped off down the road, spraying mud behind her like a retreating storm. The sheriff watched her go, then turned to Grandpa. "You really gonna take her to court?" Grandpa nodded. "She wanted to make it official. Might as well let her pay for it." The sheriff chuckled. "Can't say she didn't earn it." That evening, the orchard looked untouched again, calm and perfect. The ditches sparkled with the last of the runoff, the fence stood unbothered, and the gate's lock gleamed in the fading light. Grandpa sat on the porch sipping his tea, quiet for a long time. "Finally," he said, "people like her don't understand fences. They only see barriers where there's boundaries. But this here," he gestured toward the orchard, "this is what staying put looks like. Let the noise wear itself out." I asked him if he thought she'd come back. He shrugged. "She'll come back, just not to win. Some folks come back to see where they went wrong." The next morning, a certified envelope arrived from the courthouse, confirmation of the counterclaim filing and notice of her complaint. Grandpa read it slowly, folded it neatly, and said, "Now we wait." And wait we did. For the first time in weeks, the orchard was silent. No engines, no shouting, no drama. The apples were ripening heavy, and the air smelled sweet and damp after a light rain. But even in the calm, there was tension underneath, the kind that knows peace isn't permanent. Karen wasn't the type to let humiliation go unanswered. She'd been quiet before, and silence was never her surrender. Grandpa must have felt it too, because he oiled the gate latch again that night, polished the padlock until it gleamed under the porch light, and said softly, "Every gate tells you something if you listen close. This one says she's not done yet." The wind rustled through the orchard, carrying the faint creak of wood and the whisper of leaves, and I knew he was right. The war wasn't over, just waiting for its next round, and this time, it would move from dirt and fences to papers and courtrooms where words, not wire, would draw the lines. The courthouse smelled like old paper and polished wood, the kind of scent that carried weight. The history of other people's fights settled into every corner. Grandpa sat beside me at the long table, his hat resting on his knee, his eyes fixed forward like he was listening to the rhythm of something deeper than the judge's gavel. Karen sat across from us, immaculate as always, her hair tied back so tight it looked painful, her lawyer flipping through a binder thick with printed screenshots and HOA bylaws. She wouldn't look at Grandpa directly. She just stared at the judge, jaw tight, confidence flickering behind the cracks of her forced composure. Her lawyer began with that slick, rehearsed tone lawyers always use when they think charm will outshine facts. He spoke of community traditions, historic access paths, and neighborly cooperation. Every phrase felt heavy with fake civility, coated in the same gloss she used when she smiled for her Facebook videos. When it was Grandpa's turn, he didn't stand. He just leaned forward, slid a thin folder across the table, and said, "Everything you need's in there." The judge raised an eyebrow and opened it. Inside were the county registry deeds, survey maps, timestamps from the sheriff's reports, and photos from the security cameras. Each one clean, dated, and quiet proof that we had never done anything but protect what was ours. The judge glanced at the papers, then at Karen. "This looks straightforward," he said. Her lawyer jumped in fast, talking about implied easements and public expectation of access. Grandpa waited till he was done, then said, "If she expected to use it, she should have bought it." That line drew a few muffled laughs from the back of the courtroom, even from the bailiff who tried to hide his grin behind a cough. Karen's face flushed red, but she stayed silent. The judge flipped through the documents again. "You're telling me this HOA filed a complaint for obstruction over land that's been privately deeded for over 40 years? Her lawyer started to reply, but the judge cut him off. "And you," he said, turning to Grandpa, "filed a counterclaim for trespassing and property damage?" Grandpa nodded once. "Yes, sir," with witness statements, photographs, and sheriff reports attached. The judge exhaled through his nose, long and slow. "I've seen neighbors fight over fences before," he said, "but this is the first time someone brought a Facebook video as Exhibit A." The courtroom chuckled again. Karen stiffened, muttering something to her lawyer. The judge held up one of her printed posts. "It says here, and I quote, 'He can't keep me out. This orchard belongs to the community.'" He looked up. "Ma'am, did you post this?" She hesitated. "I was expressing frustration." "Were you on the property when you recorded this?" "I was documenting an illegal fence," she said quickly. Grandpa's voice came calm and level. "You mean the one she got stuck behind?" The judge looked between them, clearly done with the theatric. "Ma'am," he said, "trespass isn't erased by frustration. This land is his, and your own footage confirms you entered it multiple times despite being told not to." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the judge raised a hand. "Please don't interrupt. I've seen enough." He turned toward Grandpa again. "Your counterclaim mentions vandalism and damage to irrigation systems. Do you have proof?" Grandpa nodded, pulling out a small flash drive. "Photos, timestamps, and the sheriff's incident report." The clerk plugged it in, and the monitor lit up with images. The cut fence wire, the muddy tire tracks, the broken pipe. The judge leaned back, eyebrows lifting. "Clear as day," he said. Karen's lawyer whispered something urgently to her, but she looked too stunned to respond. For the next half hour, the courtroom moved through formalities. motions, exhibits, legal jargon that sounded like background noise compared to the simple truth already laid bare. Grandpa didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even look at her. He just sat still, hands folded, waiting for it to end. When the judge finally spoke, the room went quiet. "This court finds no legal basis for the HOA's complaint," he said. "Furthermore, the evidence presented supports the counterclaim. Damages are awarded to the defendant for property repair costs and legal fees. Additionally, the plaintiff and the HOA are ordered to cease all access and interference with the defendant's property effective immediately." Karen's lawyer started to object, but the judge was already standing. "Case dismissed," he said, banging the gavel once. The sound echoed like a door slamming shut on months of noise. Outside, the sky was bright and sharp, the kind of clear blue that feels cleaner after a storm. Karen walked past us without a word, her heels clicking too fast on the marble floor, her lawyer trailing behind her like a shadow. Grandpa watched her go, then put his hat back on and said, "Nothing uglier than pride with no place to go." We walked out into the sunlight, the courthouse steps warm underfoot, and for the first time in a long while, I saw the tension lift from his shoulders. "So that's it?" I asked. He nodded. "That's it for her. But the HOA'll take a while to lick its wounds." Back at the orchard, the quiet felt different. Not uneasy this time, but earned. The trees swayed softly in the breeze, and the new fence stood steady, gleaming faintly where the sun caught the wire. Neighbors began stopping by over the next few days, bringing pies, handshakes, and quiet congratulations. Most of them had known Karen's temper long before we ever fenced her out, and though they wouldn't say it aloud, they looked relieved someone had finally stood up to her. Rick even came by, his usual smoothness replaced with humility. "Sam," he said, scratching the back of his neck, "the board's decided to update the bylaws. From now on, we'll be respecting county lines first." Grandpa smiled faintly. "Good idea. Paper's lighter than a fence." Rick laughed awkwardly and left, probably hoping Karen wouldn't find out he'd stopped by. Later that evening, I found Grandpa walking the orchard rows, slow and thoughtful, the light turning gold through the branches. "You glad it's over?" I asked. He nodded. "Glad enough. You think she'll leave us alone now?" He didn't answer right away. He knelt down, brushed his hand over the soil, and said, "People like her don't know how to lose quiet. She'll move on, but she'll take her noise somewhere else." The sun dipped low, painting the gate in long shadows. Grandpa turned back toward the house, stopping once to check the lock, pressing it shut with that same deliberate care as always. "Every fence line needs peace after a fight," he said. "You let the ground breathe before you plant again." That night, the crickets sang louder than they had in weeks, and the orchard felt alive again. The air smelled of apples and wet grass, the way it always did when harvest came close. For the first time in months, I slept without listening for engines or angry voices outside. But somewhere deep down, even in the calm, I knew the story wasn't quite done. Karen's pride wouldn't let her fade quietly. She might have lost the case, but she'd find another way to make noise. Grandpa must have felt the same because the next morning, he started building something new, a hand-painted sign to hang on the gate, simple and unshakable, a message that would outlast the argument. He didn't say what it would read yet. He just worked in silence, the brush strokes slow and sure, as if writing the final line of a story only he knew how to end. The morning after the court ruling felt like waking up in a world that had finally taken a deep breath after holding it for too long. The air was cleaner, lighter, touched with that quiet satisfaction that only comes when something unjust finally breaks apart under its own weight. The orchard shimmered in the early light, dew sparkling on the apple leaves like 1,000 tiny verdicts in our favor. Grandpa was already outside before the sun cleared the ridge, sitting by the gate with his coffee and a brush in hand, painting slow, careful letters onto the wooden board he'd built from an old barn plank. The smell of linseed oil and coffee drifted together through the air. He didn't say what he was writing until I came close enough to read it. The sign said simply private property, established 1982, respect the gate, respect the ground. The letters were bold but not angry, deliberate like everything he did. I asked him if he thought she'd come back, and he smiled without looking up. She might, he said. But it won't matter anymore. The lawsuit had done what no argument ever could. It taught the HOA that paperwork and pride don't override land and law. Over the next few weeks the neighborhood went quiet. The daily gossip posts faded, the HOA meetings got smaller, and Karen disappeared from view. Her Facebook page went dark, her morning walks vanished, and her little golf cart no longer buzzed past the road. Rick stopped by one afternoon with a box of apology muffins that his wife had baked. He handed them over awkwardly and said, "The board voted to remove her as president. Thought you should know." Grandpa nodded, took the box and said, "Took you long enough." Rick looked sheepish but relieved. "For what it's worth, most of us were tired of the drama. You handled it better than anyone could've." Grandpa just grunted and went back to tightening a loose hinge on the gate. When Rick left, he opened the box, looked at the muffins and said, "She probably still thinks this place belongs to her somehow." I laughed, but even then there was a strange quiet under the humor, a sense that this story wasn't about her anymore. It was about what stayed behind. The orchard didn't just look peaceful. It felt different now, like it had taken on Grandpa's patience, his stubborn calm, his unshakable sense of what belonged where. Every time the wind moved through the branches, the leaves whispered against each other like they were talking about what had happened and what it meant. A few weeks later, we heard she'd sold her house. Rumor said she'd moved 2 towns over to some new development where she could start fresh. Grandpa chuckled when he heard. "Fresh starts are fine," he said. "Long as they don't start on someone else's land." He didn't gloat. That wasn't his way. He just carried on, checking irrigation lines, pruning trees, repairing tools, doing what he'd always done, letting time turn noise into memory. But then, one morning, as we were fixing a loose fence board near the creek, a mail truck came by and dropped off a letter with no return address. Grandpa opened it with his pocketknife. Inside was a single line written in tidy cursive, "You won this one. Enjoy your fence." He read it twice, folded it neatly, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He didn't smile, didn't comment, just said, "At least she knows how to spell fence." That was his version of closure. The seasons shifted fast after that. The apples turned red and heavy, the scent of ripening fruit filling the air so thick it felt like you could taste it. Locals started stopping by again to buy crates directly from us, and everyone had heard the story by then. Some came out of curiosity, others just to shake Grandpa's hand. He didn't talk much about it, but the story traveled on its own, changing shape with every retelling. By autumn, people were calling it the Great Orchard Showdown or the Fence War, depending on who you asked. Grandpa didn't correct anyone. He said the truth had already done its job. On the first frost morning of the season, I found him by the gate again, coffee steaming in his hand, eyes on the hills. The sun came up slow, spreading gold through the orchard. He leaned on the fence post, the wood worn smooth where his hand always rested. "Funny thing about fences," he said quietly. "They don't just keep things out. They remind you what's worth keeping in." He looked out at the trees, each one planted by his hands or his father's before him, each one standing straighter than ever. The wind moved softly through the rows, carrying the faint creak of the gate hinge, a sound that felt less like warning now and more like a heartbeat. When I asked him if he'd ever take the fence down someday, he shook his head. "Nah," he said. "It's part of the story now. You don't erase lessons, you build around them." Later that afternoon, as we loaded crates onto the truck for delivery, I noticed something nailed discreetly to the inside of the gate post, small enough that only someone standing close could read it. It was a metal tag engraved with a single phrase, "Boundaries build peace." Grandpa caught me looking at it and said, "That one's just for us." That evening, the sun set deep and red over the valley, lighting the orchard in shades of fire and honey. The gate glowed in that light, and for a moment it didn't look like a barrier at all, it looked like a monument. The world beyond it carried on as always, but within the fence line everything felt still, balanced, unbothered. As night settled, Grandpa walked the rows one last time, touching the bark of each tree like a ritual. He paused by the old oak at the far edge, the one that marked the start of our land, and stood there for a long while. When he came back, he looked lighter, almost content in a way I hadn't seen since before all the trouble began. "You know," he said, "every fence tells a story, but this one's about knowing where peace starts." He locked the gate for the night, the padlock clicking shut with that solid sound that had become part of the orchard's rhythm, then turned toward the porch. I followed, glancing back at the field. The moon had come up full and bright, silvering the tops of the trees, and for the first time, I realized the fence didn't divide anything anymore. It framed it. The land looked whole again, not because it was protected but because it was finally understood. The next morning, when the first frost glimmered across the grass, Grandpa poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed me one. We stood side by side at the fence as the sun rose, painting the valley in gold. He said, "She'll see this gate again one day. Not here, maybe, but somewhere. We all do, sooner or later. Life's full of gates. The trick is learning which ones to open and which ones to leave shut." I didn't answer. There was nothing to add. The wind rustled through the orchard, the lock gleamed, and the world beyond the fence went on being loud and restless while ours stayed quiet and steady. Grandpa took one last sip of his coffee, smiled faintly, and said, "Guess she finally learned what a boundary looks like." Then he turned back toward the house, leaving the gate closed behind him, and the orchard, wrapped in its calm and golden silence, stood like a promise kept.